We are very excited today to be joined by Dr. Eduardo Fernandez. Eduardo is joining us all the way from Adelaide. He is a senior lecturer of applied animal behaviour and welfare in the School of Animal and Veterinary Sciences out there. Eduardo did his PhD in psychology and he minored in neuroscience and animal behaviour from Indiana University. And since then, he's been going on to do lots of different applied research, looking at welfare, training of zoo, aquarium, and companion animals. And that's the kind of work that he's going to be talking to us about today. Eduardo currently runs the Operant Welfare Lab, which is dedicated to using the principles of learning to help to improve the lives of animals across a range of different settings. And so that really sort of sets the scene for what we're going to be talking about today. Where he's going to be taking us through his talk on training as enrichment from history to theory and practice. If you do have any questions, please do feel free to drop them in the chat. I'll be sort of monitoring that as we go along. And at the end of the talk, when Eduardo is finished, it'll be about 45 minutes. When he's finished, we will open up the floor to any questions. You can come on and ask your question, or if you've got any kind of internet issues or any other reason you are not able to ask the question yourself, just drop me a message and I can ask it for you. Okay, so we are ready to go whenever you are, Eduardo. Thank you very much.
Okay, hi. So by the way, I absolutely love that we've got a reptile there in the picture, a snake. That's wonderful to see. One of my, what we call HDR students out here, one of my doctoral students that I co-supervise, all of her work currently is focused on reptiles. And I was part of a workshop a couple years ago where we were talking a lot, along with John Coe and a few others, we were talking quite a bit about reptile enrichment in general. So seeing more work with reptiles is always wonderful. That said, I'm going to try to keep my rambling in general. Thank you for the introduction, which was wonderful. And I want to jump right into it because I've got about 45 minutes to talk. So if any issues come up, just please let me know. Type it into chat, or probably more likely that you will come on and talk to me, and otherwise I'll go ahead and jump into the talk. So okay, so the main point to this talk and what this talk itself is, and I'll talk a little bit about that. It's based on a review paper that I wrote that was published in Animal Welfare at the beginning of 2022, really has to do with this concept of training being enriching. And this would be a very short talk if the simple answer was anything other than yes. The idea has been proposed, of course, for a while. We hear a lot of general conversation about training itself being enriching, and it culminated almost a decade ago, where Vicki Melfi and Carolina Westlin had a little bit of back and forth talking about this in applied animal behavior science, with Vicki really proposing a few different ways, 5 different hypotheses of how training could be enriching, but saying there wasn't much evidence, and that prompted some of the back and forth. So what I like to say, and the premise to this paper itself and the talk, therefore, which is based on the paper, is that yes, training certainly can be enriching, but we cannot assume that training is enriching. So as I've already mentioned, the foundation for this presentation comes from this paper that I published, Training as Enrichment, a Critical Review, in February of 2022. I'll have a whole bunch of references throughout this talk, and at the end of the talk, there'll be a list of those references. There's a handout for this as well. And just a little aside, since I can't, for those of you who may be familiar with hearing me talk, I can't get away from giving tangents every now and then. I do have a little author's note in the paper about how this paper even came to fruition, how the manuscript came about, which was waiting to get to Australia here, waiting to get to Adelaide, to South Australia. And I had a little bit of time on my hands while I was waiting for the borders to open back up. So I started doing a deep dive into looking at all possible research that I could find in this area. So now what I'm going to detail are I'm going to mention these briefly, these three separate hypotheses and the evidence for them of how training can be enriching. I'll mention these briefly just now. So one of these being that training facilitates enrichment usage. Second one being that training modifies interactions. And the third being that training expands behavioral repertoires. Don't worry about memorizing those right now. They're going to come up again quite a few times. So I'll mention those throughout. And in addition, and really the first third or so of the talk, I'm going to talk about some of the history of training and enrichment themselves. I'm going to give some operational definitions for both concepts, and I'll detail some of that history, since I think the history is very fascinating in and of itself. So here's a basic operational definition of animal training. I won't bother reading this out, but this is taken from a few different sources. I'm primarily relying on both respondent and operant conditioning, so conditioning procedures themselves in describing what is animal training, often what we think of as the husbandry training procedures we see in zoos. Now, what I'm primarily going to talk about is operant reinforcement, positive reinforcement based procedures. This is important, especially when I talk to people outside of zoos. In zoos, we're not going to see much else when we're talking about husbandry training. But when you see some other training procedures that are commonly used, for instance, with dog training, we'll see some procedures that rely heavily on punishment, on aversive stimuli, punishment, negative reinforcement. That's a little hard to talk about using punishment in some way and then referring to some type of enrichment condition. So our focus is really here on positive reinforcement-based training procedures. And also, for our purposes here, the training alone must be enriching. This is very important within the zoo world, because certainly a lot of our, in fact, the majority, I would say, of our husbandry training procedures are used in some type of veterinary care procedure, right? This is the premise to husbandry training that leads to improved welfare at some level. But we're talking often about an improvement in the physiological welfare of the animals. They're able to receive this veterinary procedure. We don't know, it would probably be a better way of saying this, we don't know if that training alone was enriching, and I'm going to talk about training itself as being enriching, not as a mediating variable, mediating or moderating variable, but the training itself is enriching. Okay, so that leads to an operational definition of environmental enrichment. Again, I'm not going to read this out. The paper goes into a bit more detail about how I'm defining environmental enrichment here based on a number of these different papers. So now what I do like to specify is that by this definition, and I think this is important for enrichment in general, enrichment is not a thing. It is not just some stimulus, some object. It is an interaction between some response and that stimulus or event. So what that means is it requires two rules: that the enrichment is not just the object or the event, it is a contingency that involves behavior change, and there must be a demonstrated positive welfare effect for the interaction to be defined as enriching. So this is one of those things that I sometimes a bit facetiously say, it's not enrichment until you show me it's enriching. It's not enrichment unless it enriches. So enrichment should have some clearly observable change in typically behavior, although we can look at other ways, physiological changes, maybe how we're measuring affect at some level, but certainly there has to be some positive welfare change. Okay, so how do we know training is enriching? Well, simple answer here, it's going to be through science. And as I've already talked about these three hypotheses, I'm going to detail them after we get through the history here. Again, training facilitates enrichment usage, training modifies interactions, and training expands behavioral repertoires. All three of these are modified from the 5 hypotheses that Vicki Melfi listed in her original paper talking about training as enrichment. So, which was 2013 or 2014. So right about a decade ago. And each one of these hypotheses, the way that I've described them here, treats the training as the independent variable, the IV, and the enriched effect as the dependent variable. In other words, it makes it really easy to measure. So training is what is manipulated, enrichment is what is measured, and we can see that effect. That's why I think this is important if we're trying to demonstrate empirically that training is enriching, which I think is important rather than simply assuming that training may be enriching, then we have to have a way to be able to quantify it. And again, we measure enrichment by an improvement in the welfare, often behavioral welfare of an animal. Okay, so now we got through that first component there. Let's talk a little bit about first the history of modern animal training, and then we'll get into the history of environmental enrichment itself. And I have a couple pictures here. One of those, you may be wondering, why does that look like, I think, B.F. Skinner putting a pigeon inside a bomb? If that's what you were thinking, it's because that is exactly what is happening in that artist's rendition. I'm going to describe that here in a little bit. As weird as that it sounds, it is what happened historically and part of what led to how we understand modern animal training. So much of what we think of modern animal training procedures comes from 2 events, which is Skinner's discovery or his first description of shaping, which occurred in his 1951 article, How to Teach Animals. And then the creation of a field of applied animal psychology by Keller and Marion Breland, which their paper was published in 1951 as well. And on that bottom left picture there is actually Keller Breland and B.F. Skinner on top of the General Mills building in Minneapolis, Minnesota. So Keller Breland was a graduate student in psychology at that time in the 40s, and B.F. Skinner was a professor there at University of Minnesota. So both of these events, as I've already alluded to, were tied to what's called Project Pelican or Project Pigeon. And Project Pigeon was exactly like that picture up in the top left shows. So in 1940, coming back from an American Psychological Association conference in Chicago, Skinner was on a train. He was trying to think, there was World War II was happening at that time. He was trying to think, how can we get some bombs guided in some way? What kind of animal could I train to guide these bombs? Keep in mind, this is 1940. There are no missiles. Bombs are dropped out of planes. And based on where you release them and all the physics involved, they land where they land. So Skinner wanted to see if there was some way you could train an animal to guide those bombs. And he happened to see pigeons outside his train window and thought, they have really great visual acuity. They're probably pretty trainable. He did not know, but he thought they're probably pretty trainable. When I get back to Minnesota, I'm going to get me some pigeons. And that's exactly what he did. And starting in 1941, he and some graduate students started the project that ran for a couple years and then lagged for a little bit, but had some funding here and there. And they did this in the General Mills building. And if you're wondering, why does that sound familiar? The General Mills building is in the building where cereal, I think Frosted Flakes and some other cereals that some of may be more Americanized than what you may have there, but lots of cereal. General Mills is the company that makes a lot of products, including breakfast cereals, good old American breakfast cereals. And they funded this project to start training pigeons to guide the fins on the back of these bombs. In the process of doing that, they took animals outside of a laboratory environment. And that meant they started training, as Skinner would describe, by hand pigeons. So they had animals. Until that time, all Skinner had done was reward or reinforce these lever presses of rats in Skinner boxes in operant chambers. And this was the first time that they started doing all these things to train pigeons in this case. And they were pretty astounded by the things they started to observe and what they started to describe. Now, that said, by the 1950s, so by 1943, I believe, Keller and Marion Breland left academia altogether. That's how impressed they were by these procedures that they had devised. And by the early 90s, so they started training. They actually received a General Mills grant in 1947 for training animals for applied purposes. By the early 1950s, they moved to Arkansas and started Animal Behavior Enterprises, which there's some pictures there on the right. That's Professor Punch, I believe, is the bunny's name there. Wonderful name for a bunny. That they were training with what they had. They started out roadside attractions, what was called IQ Zoo, where they would show people the power of reinforcement. This is early 1950s. That people coming in, pulling off the side of the road to get gas, they'd come in and see this little show. They were also doing a lot of other training. They were training animals for commercials. They were training animals that would run arcade-like games in state fairs. They started running some training projects for the government, including search and rescue goals. So quite a lot. And by 1955, so I mentioned here that creation of IQ Zoo, but by 1955, they began training dolphins, starting in Marineland. So Marineland in Florida, that's a picture of Keller Breland on the bottom right there, training a bottlenose dolphin. So until that time, there was no use or only accidental use, I guess I could say, of any specific type of reinforcement contingency. So the Brelands were the first to start training dolphins and other marine mammals for the purpose of these shows. So the rest is a bit, there's a bit of history in between there, but because they use these transparent, reward-focused set of training procedures, it took off across a number of other marine parks that began training marine mammals as well. Some of the people they trained went on to start SeaWorld and other organizations. This eventually led to Karen Pryor in the 1960s, training dolphins primarily out in Hawaii. And Karen Pryor then is the one who popularized clickers and now runs Clicker Expo. It was eventually in the 80s, going into the 90s, that San Diego Zoological Society and San Diego Zoo hired Gary Priest, who was an orca trainer for SeaWorld in San Diego. And they brought in Gary Priest to start doing these different husbandry training procedures. So that was this is all tying right back to Keller and Marion Breland. And that's where we got so much of what we do today now with these reward-focused training procedures that we see around zoos all around the world now, right, for our husbandry training procedures. Okay, so again, this Fernandez and Martin article that we published a couple of years ago details both of these histories. So does the Fernandez 2022 paper that this presentation is based on. but the Fernandez and Martin article published in Journal of Zoological and Botanical Gardens really details this incredibly more. So the history of environmental enrichment is equally interesting, if not more so, I think, interesting, because we can think about it stemming. Now, there were things described as enrichment, but they were typically described as conditions. They were things that came from the laboratory back in the 50s, for instance, 50s and 60s, where people would talk about enriched versus impoverished conditions. But the first real use of talking about enrichment, particularly enrichment in zoos, which is where environmental enrichment originated, came from some of the work Hal Markowitz and his colleagues were doing in the 1970s. That's one example there on the left, by the way, which I'll talk about here in a little bit. So one of the first papers that Markowitz published describing this was in 1978 in the very first issue of the Behavior Analyst, where he details some of this. So if you've never read that Markowitz 1978 article about engineering environments in zoos, it's still to this day one of my favorite articles of all time. It is wonderful. So what Markowitz was talking about was engineering these environments to get these particular responses that he thought would be beneficial for the animals. So in other words, he was devising operant conditioning procedures. Hal Markowitz himself was a behavior analyst who happened to be hired by the Portland Metro Park Zoo, what's now known as the Oregon Zoo, that's in Portland, Oregon. He went on to work with the San Francisco Zoo and I believe Honolulu Zoo, one of the zoos in Hawaii, which is where this Asian elephant is. So what Markowitz would see are these animals in an environment. So he saw these antecedent stimuli and he thought of specific responses that he wanted them doing. I'll describe a couple of these examples here on the next slide. And then he would reward those actions. So he would use reinforcement, the consequences there for the reinforcement contingency. So he would reinforce the response that he desired. In other words, what we know as the ABC contingency or the three-term contingency. So very traditional operant conditioning, very basic behavior analytic work. This is where all of environmental enrichment started. Now, here's a couple of the examples I promised you. By the way, let me go back a second and mention this elephant. You can see what I'm guessing many of you can actually take a pretty good guess at what's happening here. The elephant comes over, pulls on this chain. That lever there on the other side, it's connected to some food that gets thrown into the exhibit. So the elephant can continue to pull on this chain and cause food to be thrown into the exhibit. It gets to work for its food. We'll talk about that a little bit in this talk about contra freeloading and some of how that's connected to enrichment as well. So let me detail another couple examples here. One of those, the elephant was in Hawaii, I think Honolulu Zoo. So these other couple examples here, the one on the bottom right, I'd like to talk about first, which is a polar bear at the Portland Metro Park Zoo. These were polar bears. Any of you who have worked with polar bears, I spent about a half a decade doing research with polar bears, studying stereotypies. You know how stereotypic the activity of polar bears can be. And in this case, they had a couple polar bears, one in particular who spent all day pacing. This is the 1970s, keep in mind. There's not a lot happening in this environment for this polar bear. So Markowitz created these voice-activated mechanical devices, in other words, a microphone, that was connected to a conveyor belt that had fish on that conveyor belt. So the polar bears could now go over. This was all run. It was a pretty elaborate contraption. You can see pictures of this in Hal Markowitz's 1982 book, Behavioral Enrichment in the Zoo, which was one of the first times that we see the term enrichment being used to describe these activities, was that 1982 book that Hal Markowitz published. So the polar bears would vocalize into the microphone, and that was like a polar bear's personal Alexa. The polar bear does whatever in polar bearese is the equivalent of Alexa, give me a fish, which I'm assuming is a very scary sound, by the way, for a polar bear. Again, spent half a decade working with them. They're terrifying and wonderful all at the same time. That would result in a fish being launched into the exhibit. And there we see a polar bear chasing after the fish. So the polar bear could request its own fish. Pretty ingenious, especially considering this was almost half a century ago that this was that Hal Markowitz and his colleagues developed this. So the above right picture actually comes from Markowitz and LaForce, 1987. It was data they collected, I believe, in the early 80s. And this was a serval at San Francisco Zoo. They had artificial prey that would run through this tube. Serval would chase the prey and they would give it a reward when it would chase the prey. So pretty ingenious and ranged from simple to very elaborate contraptions that they created. Now, I'm guessing many of you already can think of some of the criticisms that may have occurred. There were a number that were made. One of the biggest ones being that this behavioral engineering practice was contrived. So people like David Hancock, Michael Hutchins, Carolyn Crockett pointed out that they said animals need complexity, and what they argued for was naturalistic complexity. I loved Markowitz's response here, which comes from his 1982 book. Here, I'll let you all read it, but I love this response because he's in essence saying, look, you still need to account for what the animal can do, how it can operate in its environment. Just making something natural, naturalistic, beautiful, whatever words we want to use to describe it, doesn't mean the animal is going to interact with its environment. Nonetheless, Hal Markowitz did start incorporating naturalistic designs into his enrichment. For instance, this Markowitz et al. Article published in 1995, done with the San Francisco Zoo, had some wonderful, I believe they were either leopards or leopard cats that would follow the sounds of birds along a tree trunk. And if they followed it across the tree trunk, they would end up getting a reward. So now today, and thanks in large part to, there was an article published by Deborah Forthman under Forthman and Quick, or Forthman Quick, 1984, where she looked to bridge these two concepts of behavioral engineering and naturalistic complexity. And that's what it was, Deborah Forthman's article, that helped initiate some of this modern movement of environmental enrichment. Hi, you might want to mute yourself. Sorry, you might want to mute yourself. We can, thank you. Perfect. All right. So now that we've covered some of the history, let's jump into these different hypotheses, which the first of these being that training facilitates enrichment usage. This is certainly the simplest of the hypotheses, the easiest to demonstrate, one of the most direct ones to demonstrate. What we're talking about is that if we increase enrichment, sorry, I got muted there for a second. So if we increase enrichment device usage itself, then the training was enriching, right? If we get the animal to interact with an enrichment device, then we're producing an enrichment interaction. Surprisingly, there's very few studies, almost no studies on this concept. Now, there's the older Markowitz examples where, and he did quite a number, where he would train animals to interact with different devices. But again, many of these were very contrived. And they required the contingencies to stay in place. The animal had to keep getting reinforced through those contrived interactions. But certainly they would count as training enrichment device usage, some type of device usage that led to increased activity. One of the few modern studies is a paper I published a few years ago, and it happened to involve penguins. So I'm going to show you that example here, which comes from this Fernandez et al. It's Fernandez, Kinley, and Timberlake, 2019, published in Zoo Biology. So in this case, what we had were a couple devices that we could fill with fish. And we had a few penguins. We actually started with a couple different species, 4 penguins total. So we had 2 Magellanic and 2 rockhopper penguins. So Buddy, Maggie, Sport, and Hemingway. And we had these were what you could buy at a pet store. These were hamster balls, the kind of things that a little rodent like a hamster can run around in, that people sometimes get, that may not be very promoting of the welfare of those animals. But we took a couple of these devices and modified them, as you can see in the bottom left. We also ended up measuring multiple other rockhoppers later. And again, I'm giving you some brief details about this study. I'm not going to cover too much here. If you're interested, I'm happy to get you a copy of the paper. By the way, those are rockhopper and Magellanic penguins right there. The rockhoppers on the left, Magellanic penguins on the right. And again, those 2 enrichment devices really allowed us to be able to manipulate, to put fish in, to not have fish in them. They were smelt that we used, and they were devices that the penguins themselves could be able to pull the fish out of the devices. Now, I'm not going to detail all of these conditions. There's a lot there. Again, I'll redirect you to the paper, and I'm happy to get anybody this paper. But there were multiple observation periods. What I do want to point out is what we did was we combined training without food in the devices. We had training with food in the devices. And the point was to show that we could maintain the training in the absence of the training procedures. So we extinguished the response. We provided the devices without food, without any more training. And then we saw if that produced the response of getting the fish out on their own. That was our idea of a lasting contingency. We looked at 2 measures. I'm really only going to show you, I'm going to focus on one of those, which is the contact with the devices. So the continuous ball hits that we would see. And again, I'm not going to cover too much of the methodological details here, but this was a reversal design that we use, focused on single case design or within subject manipulations. So this is some of the data, and this is showing from session 20 to the end of the study, session 37. What we're seeing here is the training when we started to produce. On the top of the graph, by the way, are the individual penguins. Those are all 9 that we measured from this point of the study on. So there's 7 rockhoppers, 2 Magellanic penguins there. And on the bottom are the total hits across all of the penguins, so regardless of penguins, which is what we ran our statistics, our inferential statistics on. So what we see is during the training with food in the device, we start to produce some of these interactions, some of these contacts with the device, right? So we're seeing some of that. And then we extinguish the response. We stop the training, we pulled the food out of the device, we got rid of, it took a few sessions, not very many, but we got rid of almost all the responses. And then all we did was reintroduce the device with no more training, but food in the device. And what we saw was an immense spike in the contacts to the device. So that's food in the devices. Simple answer here, can the penguins get the fish out on their own? Again, yes. I wouldn't want to just show you this data without being able to tell you a little bit about it, or show you more a little bit about it. So this is a video of the penguins during one of those last sessions. And what you can see is they've pushed this one device into the back corner. The penguins are all attacking the device, getting fish out. What you're going to see is something really interesting here. That's a rockhopper porpoising. We had not seen that before. This is Cincinnati Zoo. and neither had some of those kids. They jumped up and got pretty excited to watch this rockhopper porpoising. By the way, these devices continue to be used at Cincinnati Zoo years later. So it's a wonderful example of getting this to keep going. And I hope could provide an example of maintained of ways to train, rather than just simply saying, I'm going to look for devices that animals interact with, and if they do, they do. If they don't, they don't. Can we somehow change the conditions to get them to interact with devices they previously would not? So that's one of the ways we can take advantage of individual learning and producing a training as enrichment effect. Okay, so there's a few other examples, at least indirect examples. John Coe and some others, Carter et al. So John Coe and Julia Hoy published a paper a few years ago talking about using computer devices as enrichment. And if you're training the animals in some way to interact with the enrichment devices, which is Carter et al. Used Xbox Kinects with orangs. So it was a really wonderful study that they did. That's an example, at least indirectly. Certainly there's other good indirect evidence, for instance, from contra freeloading. I alluded to this before. Animals being willing to work for food, that's the concept of contra freeloading. So David Powell has a paper he published a few years ago showing that some giraffes would choose to pull food out of enrichment devices over getting free food. So really great example. And then preference assessments. There's some interesting examples here again. So Nicole Dorey and colleagues did a study where they showed that some wolves, this is in a facility down in Florida, so in Central Florida, some wolves would choose training activities over enrichment. So that suggests, at least indirectly, that the animals found the training to be enriching. Okay, let's move on to our second hypothesis here, which is that training facilitates or modifies interactions. In this case, we can talk about we can talk about interactions with other animals or people. And we certainly know that training animals increases their interactions with us. But the question is, are those interactions enriching? There's certainly some evidence from the primate literature that training can improve conspecific interactions, which I think is one of the most important demonstrations, that somehow training animals can change how they interact with their fellow species. So Spiezio has a couple papers along these lines. And there's also some good evidence that aversive training is not enriching. So there's a number of studies, both with dogs and cats, that shows that there can be potential fallout, that using aversives to train animals itself does not have an enriching effect. So there's lots of indirect evidence of this modified interaction that comes from the human-animal interaction, or the AVI, the animal visitor interaction literature. So AVI literature. There's certainly some indication of highs and zoos being enriching. So one of those examples comes from an old, I'm sure I'll pronounce their names incorrectly, as I pronounce lots of things incorrectly, but Niemann and Dalziel showed that they had a long-billed corella, right? So cockatoo, I believe, that would seek out visitor interactions. Now, this was qualitatively described in their paper, but nonetheless, at least some indirect interaction. A little bit more direct evidence from the idea that training zoo house, in this case, training for public feedings. We have a paper we published a couple years ago, done through Woodland Park Zoo, that showed that the elephants that engaged in a public feeding actually showed increased foraging, decreased inactivity, and decreased stereotypic activity, decreased inactivity, I should say. So all signs, all positive welfare indicators, right? So it's seen that the public feeding itself had some positive welfare effects, and they had to be trained to interact, to engage in these public feeding interactions at some level. Okay, we get to our final hypothesis here, which is that training expands behavioral repertoires. Now, this is an incredibly broad category. The simple idea, at least as simplified as I can make it here, is that does learning new behavior allow for increased enriched experiences? It's tentative to say, and in fact, Vicki Melfi described it as one of her hypotheses this way, that learning equals enrichment. So Vicki Melfi, in her original paper discussing how we could empirically test this concept, proposed 3 different hypotheses for how training might expand behavioral repertoires. The first being training affords learning, which is enriching. The second being that training achieves the same result as enrichment. And the third being that training provides dynamic change in the animal's day. I just happen to really mash all 3 of these hypotheses into one simplified version of this, which is that training in some way produces new behaviors. So it expands the behavioral repertoire of the animals. So what's the evidence for this? Well, there's certainly, as Melfi concluded back in 2013, there was essentially very little, if any, evidence for it. And that hasn't changed too much, at least in terms of direct evidence. Again, one of the reasons why we need more data on these concepts. There's indirect evidence, and some of the indirect evidence comes from the shelter environments. So there's a couple wonderful papers that looked at adoption rates of animals, in this case, dog adoption rates in shelters, right, in canine shelters. So this is published almost a decade and a half ago. Again, I apologize for mispronouncing their names, but I think it's Lusker and Medlock, 2009. What they showed were the dogs that received these training procedures that actually were trained were more likely to be adopted. So, and we could argue that one of the most important welfare indices is getting to continue to behave. So being adopted would allow you to continue to exist, would allow the dog to continue to exist. So pretty important. Now,
hey Eduardo, just to give you a 5-minute warning.
Perfect, thank you. We're right on time, so that's great. So one of the so Grant and Warrior, a decade later, did a similar study, again published in Applied Animal Behavior Science. I believe Lusker and Medlock was also published in Applied Animal Behavior Science. And in this case, they trained a handful of cats, but now rather than look at adoption rates, they looked at what the cats did as a result of training. And it resulted in increased behaviors that they associated with adoption and also happened to be associated with positive welfare indices. So things like time spent exploring. So they were more active as a result of being trained. There's also some evidence that training reduces undesired behaviors like stereotypies. So Shin and Block published this almost a decade and a half ago, showing that they reduced, I believe, with African wild dogs, were able to reduce stereotypies as a result of training. And there's certainly more evidence coming out about some of these effects now. So since this paper was published, I think there's been a couple more papers looking at some of the effects of training in producing positive welfare indices. And finally, Delfour et al. Had a really interesting paper a few years ago showing that dolphins, in this case, using a modified type of qualitative behavioral assessment, a QBA, that they called willingness to participate, and that the dolphins in the shows would seek out trainers in this case. So the dolphins were looking to be trained. Okay, so as we sum up, as we get to the end of this, I've gone through these 3 hypotheses. training is often assumed to be enriching. There's certainly empirical evidence, but a lot of the evidence is indirect. So there's not a ton of direct evidence still. A decade after Melfi originally pointed out, there wasn't a ton of evidence for these concepts. There's still not a lot of direct evidence. There's certainly quite a bit more, especially indirect evidence. And I think part of the reason is because it's a question that requires precise definitions and should be context specific. We need to look for the quantitative ways of measuring enriching effects of training procedures. So part of that would include more research that uses newer welfare-based measures, for instance, behavioral diversity and enclosure use variability. So examinations of learning over time. There's a lot of wonderful stuff to be talked about with using things like single case or within subject designs to measure the individual welfare effects, and that have become far more commonplace. And ultimately, if we want to say our training itself improves the lives of our animals, in and of itself, the training is enriching in some way, we need to show that enriching effect. And I think there's a lot of opportunities in reward-based dog training procedures, although also, and since we're amongst zoo people here, there's a lot of things that can be done in the zoo environment, particularly things in settings like in our petting zoos with ambassador animals, when we can, and with the husbandry training procedures that we're using in zoos, where we can use those as study variables, as independent variables, and look at potential enriching effects. Ultimately, more science makes for better application. So thank you. I'll show you the references here in a second. And there are some easy ways to get in contact with me. I think there's a handout which will have all this contact info. My email is also on the very last slide. Again, I'm happy to make, if the handout is not readily accessible, you can email me. I'm happy to get you the handout as well. And otherwise, this is a long list of references that I've cited here. There's many more in the paper. And I think we're good to open it up to questions.
Super, thanks so much, Eduardo. That's a really great talk. We have got a few questions. Do you want to pop your video on to take some questions? I didn't want to interrupt, and I didn't also want the internet to crash.
Yeah.
So if we go to Alyssa, Alyssa's got a couple of questions actually, if that's okay, Alyssa
Sure.
Weimar.
Yes, thank you. Then I'll also do my video on. Yeah, my first question was about more in the beginning that you mentioned that enrichment, what was it again? Training for vet care can be helpful, but the training is not enrichment. And I was basically wondering why exactly that would be.
Well, I don't want to say the training isn't enriching, but what I'm saying is we can't simply say that husbandry training itself is enriching, that it produces an enriching effect, because it may be that it's a mediating or it's an indirect effect, that maybe what's happening is because we trained an animal, for instance, to be able to engage in a veterinary procedure that improved their physiological welfare, and that was the welfare change. So that's all I mean. But I would imagine that much of the husbandry training procedures we use are in fact enriching. I think most positive reinforcement training is enriching, and that's what I find so surprising, is how little we've documented that.
Yeah, so basically you also need more research to get an answer to that. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
More quantification. Quantification.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. I did have one other question related to that, but that probably then also needs more research. I was wondering if target training would be enrichment or not.
Sorry, what was it? If what would be?
If target training, so using a target.
Yeah. So I think Now, there's some interesting stuff about target training in and of itself, and I would actually argue that a lot of target training actually relies more heavily on respondent conditioning procedures than it does operant conditioning. That in and of itself would require a whole other talk to get into things like auto shaping, which has been looked at in the behavioral literature, but I'll leave it at that. But yeah, I would imagine that target training is itself such a useful tool, and it's training, and we have a lot of reinforcement contingencies involved. So yeah, I think there's probably a lot of enriching effects, and we have yet to really document it.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Thank you. Those were my questions.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Great, thanks,
Yeah.
Eduardo.
Thank you for asking that.
Thank you. We've got another question as well from Bridge Kishore Gupta. Do you want to ask your question, Bridge?
Yeah. Hello, Fernandez. How are you?
Hi.
Can you? Yeah. Actually, I just wanted to know, because I have also worked a little bit on the enrichment for my thesis here in India on sloth bears. Just want to know whether public feeding the animals in a zoo can be encouraged, because many times I've seen that it transmits the wrong message, conservation message. So what do you say about it?
Well, a couple interesting points there. One is about 45 minutes after I get out of here, I'm going to be as part of a panel of the EAZA at the concert or education conference that is in Poland. So I'll be remotely part of that panel where we're talking about visitor experiences. Since I spend a lot of my time talking about both visitor effects and visitor experiences, all of which fall under this idea of animal-visitor interactions or human-animal interactions in zoos. Now, that said, there is often an assumption, I think, again, I would say that there's an empirical question to be asked here, but there's often an assumption that public feeding itself may be problematic because it gives the wrong message to the public. And there's not a ton of research that has directly examined this. There's some stuff coming out now in the UK in the past few years, especially with lemurs. There's some stuff that Courtney Collins has done. There's a few other papers that have looked at this idea of what effect are these interactions having. We have a paper actually, well, there's the elephant study that I cited, but it's not always clear what is the visitor learning from the public feeding interaction. We don't know, is what I would argue. In many cases, there's a lot of unpacking that I think we need to see. But it's a really important idea, right? We want to be careful about what message is being conveyed to the public. So now, interestingly, the second thing I was just going to say quickly about that is there's an old study done in the 70s, I think 78, by Van Keulen-Kromhout that looked at some of the effects of different types of exhibits for bears. Since you mentioned sloth bears, I'm wearing a bear shirt. Bears happen to be great. Some of my favorites. So, and Van Keulen-Kromhout did a study in 78 or so, looking at different types of exhibits and their effects on bear behavior. And one of the things that she found was a reduction of stereotypies as a result of some of the public feeding interactions. So really interesting, although this was done in Germany, and most likely at that time, it was people bringing in their own food, which was probably not great for the bears. And it was not keeper mediated. But what I would say is we need more research on this concept and this idea. And I think it's good to argue when in doubt, that means it's a good research question.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Fernandez. Thank you. Bye.
Yeah, thank you.
Fabulous, thank you. Another great question. Thanks, Eduardo. We've got one that's come in online. So this one is, you said at the beginning of your talk, there was some really sort of incredible examples of the kind of progressive thinking in terms of enrichment, you know, even way back when we're looking at the polar bear device. So what do you think is the kind of the biggest sort of limitation or the barriers to kind of overcoming rapid progression in this field?
Limitations for enrichment usage, or you mean in terms of how?
I think it's sort of limitations, barriers to overcome that kind of the progression in enrichment and the development of different. So obviously back then that was kind of quite a sort of a novel thing to be doing. Like, what are the kind of limitations that we face now in terms of development of more novel devices?
Yeah, I think we see how prevalent enrichment is now in so many different settings. Certainly, it owes its creation to happening in the zoo world. It boomed in the zoo world, and now it's everywhere, right? Farms, labs, homes, it's everywhere, the use of enrichment. And I think there's two big things that I say, which one is the focus on, we need to start talking about enrichment as that interaction, not simply a thing. I'm not a particularly big fan of simply describing enrichment based on its stimulus properties. So what I mean by that is just saying, oh, I'm giving them auditory enrichment, I'm giving them visual enrichment, I'm giving them sensory enrichment, whatever that is. That's not describing the interaction, and we don't know if the object itself is enriching until we see some positive change until we see an enriched effect. So that's, I think, changing how we think about enrichment to say there's a lot of things I'm giving an animal, but I don't know how many of them are enriching until I see a change in how they're interacting or they've responded in some way physiologically to that enrichment. Then we say that that's enrichment. So I think that's one of the important things, but then obviously based on my talk, I would argue that I would like to see more, rather than simply treating enrichment as a trial and error process, saying, let's think about why this might or might not work, and are there things that we can do to make it work or even more effective than it already is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, fabulous. Thank you so much. I think we've just got time for one last question, which has just come in from Izzy Clegg. If you want to pop your mic on and ask that question, Izzy.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I was wondering, for animals that where they receive all of their daily diet in a series of training sessions throughout the day, do you think it's a kind of almost like a safeguarding thing, or to have at least some sessions which aren't contingent on training sessions, so some feeding opportunities, so either a free feed or a feeding and enrichment, just in case that training isn't actually enriching, and they don't have a choice. If they want to receive that food, they're going to have to participate in the training.
Yeah, absolutely. Boy, I have about 2 minutes to answer what I want to spend about 2 hours talking about. So I'll say a couple things. I just had a paper published earlier this year in the Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis, and it has very little to do with zoos. It has a lot to do with these antecedent stimuli and their effects, including food delivery, that is independent of a contingency, and the ways that those can promote welfare. I also have a paper under review about giving, again, response-independent food deliveries for sheltered dogs, a study we did out of San Diego. Because I do quite a bit of zoo and companion animal work. So I think what you're pointing out, and we're talking about now a closed economy is the way this has been described, closed versus open economies, which is, do you work for all your food, or can you get some of your food outside? Like if you don't, it's usually used to describe laboratory conditions, but it's still a useful thing to talk about in behavioral economics, closed versus open economies. And what I would argue is there's a lot of really great evidence for creating contingencies that are, or creating a lack of contingencies for animals where there's some type, especially, and a lot of my dissertation work did this with response independent schedules with polar bears. And what I published a few years ago, some of the polar bear studies we did with giving fixed time and variable time food schedules that were independent of any type of response requirement for the animal. So I'm a big fan, big advocate of giving some of these free opportunities. And I think it really depends on how you arrange the environment. That was my 2-minute answer. And I think we need to, we're supposed to be scheduled at some point, Isabella, to talk in the future, because we have some, lots of Adelaide Zoo and other Australian things to talk about. So we'll have to continue this conversation. So wonderful question.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you so much. Thanks.
Yeah,
that's fantastic. Thank you. I think that's a really great way to finish as well. Fantastic question. So just to say, obviously, thank you so much, Eduardo, for coming along and for extending your day for us, your working day. And thank you to everybody for joining us today. Eduardo's details are in the chat, so please do grab those before you go, and just obviously get in touch with Eduardo directly if you've got any further questions. Thanks very much, everybody.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. This was really wonderful. So I look forward to hearing from many of you in the near future.
Thank you.
Thank you.